And one of the most compelling things that I have found when it comes to public testimony on Native mascots is actually hearing from the students themselves. When you're talking about war chants or tomahawks or even just the cartoon figures that we have on the sides of school buildings. As a matter of fact, just recently I heard that Saugus has a whole new school building with a large Indian head on the side of the building.
So there's so many contributions of Native people to the land. One of the most important ones is democracy. So for us, the Haudenosaunee people, people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin looked towards our people and how we governed ourselves and took that and used it for the United States. Except they left out something very important, which is the women.
Well, a good evening to everybody out there on the internet. Welcome to our November edition of Boston Talks, live from my living room here in Somerville, Massachusetts, by my virtual fireplace, virtually coming on your screen. And we're really thankful to have you with us. As you know, with our Boston Talks, we like to center in on a theme. And today, we are talking about Native American culture. Our speakers tonight, we're going to be talking with artist, filmmaker, and educator Katsitsionni Fox. And we'll also be talking with Jean-Luc Pierite, who is the president of the board of directors at the North American Indian Center of Boston. And without further ado, I'd like to get things started with Jean-Luc. So I'm going to welcome him to my screen and yours. There he is, Mr. Jean-Luc. How are you today?
As is our practice at the North American Indian Center of Boston, I just wanted to first recognize that I am calling from the traditional Indigenous territory of the Massachusetts Nation, who continue to this day in part through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. My name is Jean-Luc Pierite. I'm originally from New Orleans. I'm a member of the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, where my family does language and culture preservation work. And yeah, thank you for having me, Edgar.
Really excited. What did you just say right at the outset there? Can you do that again for me?
Yes, Heni Hotu Lati Lapu, that's just our way of saying greetings, everyone. It's the Tunica. So Heni Hotu, greetings all, Lati Lapu, good evening, Lawa Lapu, good evening. And I also gave a quick land acknowledgement, as we do whenever we introduce ourselves. For North American Indian Center of Boston, we find that it's most appropriate before we introduce ourselves that we recognize the traditional Indigenous territory of the Massachusetts Nation. So we're doing a land acknowledgement, but we also, in part, we do that because we are making agreements with our host tribe. A lot of us as urban American Indians here in the greater Boston area, we come from all over the United States. And as a matter of fact, we call it the North American Indian Center of Boston because we are provide services not only for American Indians, but also First Nations and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians. And we do try to do as much outreach as possible to all Indigenous peoples, especially those immigrant communities from Central and South America. But if we are not Indigenous to this territory, then we are guests, even as Indigenous peoples. And so it is right for us to position ourselves as guests and make agreements with our hosts, such as supporting every effort by the tribe, by the original peoples, to rematriate all land and natural resources back to them.
I am speaking with Jean-Luc Pierite. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Jean-Luc, you can pop them into the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and I'm going to try to get to as many of your questions for him as I possibly can. So you say you are from the New Orleans area, but here you are. You live, I think, currently in Jamaica Plain. How did that? What was that journey? How did that happen?
Yeah, so 15 years ago, this year, this is the anniversary, well, this year was the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, in which my family and many of our community members back home in New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast as well, lost our homes. And so my family had relocated to our tribal land, which is around central Louisiana. And I had just finished a degree in video game design at that time. So I decided to kind of bounce around the country, looking for work, doing some coding and stuff like that. And eventually I landed here in Massachusetts in 2011.
Okay. Okay. So, so you are the president of the board of directors for the North American Indian Center of Boston. What is that organization, and what is it, generally speaking, that you do?
Yeah. So this past October 20th, we just recognized our 50th anniversary of service to the New England Native American community. NAICOB first started off in 1969 through a series of meetings, and then on October 20th, 1970, it was incorporated as Boston Indian Council. In 1991, we reorganized as North American Indian Center of Boston. And we do, primarily, we have a federally funded program through the Department of Labor in which we do everything we can to find our community members full-time employment, whether that's assistance with interviews, assistance with clothes, just finding jobs. But we do so much more than that. Our staff goes above and beyond, especially in this year during COVID. We've taken on the situation from the grassroots. Unfortunately, here in Massachusetts, the Department of Public Health does not disaggregate data for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so we've taken on a grassroots campaign in which we've distributed upwards of 1,000 sets of PPE to American Indian families and Indigenous immigrant communities, so that we can get the data from the grassroots. We've also served on health advisory equity committees, and we also do some legislative advocacy through the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. So even though we have most of our operations remotely right now, we are busier than ever, I would say.
Yeah. I'm going to turn over to the Q&A. We've got some questions popping in from some of our listeners. So Jean-Luc, Beth, who lives in Melrose, says you just used the word rematriate. She says that's a term she recently learned. Can you talk a little bit about tribal land and rematriation, what that means?
Yes, so it's a bit of a turn from repatriation, which, I mean, it's still in a way it's a kind of it's a way to navigate, because as Indigenous peoples, we are not necessarily heteropatriarchal. Our traditional forms of governance are largely matriarchal. And so we have our own ways of talking about what does it mean to not just reacquire land and put it into the Indigenous nations holdings, but what does that mean to actually be a steward of the land and the natural resources? So yeah, really good question.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. You know, you sort of mentioned the Massachusetts legislative agenda. I see a question that we have here in the Q&A from Nikki or Nietzsche Meadow. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. Sorry about that. But they're asking, what are best practices to convince schools to stop using Native American mascots, such as tomahawks, etc. I know that that's something that there's been legislation sort of proposed around here in Massachusetts, but it's just one thing. So maybe address that, and also talk more broadly about here in Massachusetts, kind of what's going on at the State House and other places in terms of like trying to advance what's going on in the Native American communities.
Yeah, so for starters, you know, there's Native solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We're definitely feeling the boost and the re-energizing in terms of addressing racial equity for Indigenous peoples here in Massachusetts through that movement. And one of the most compelling things that I have found when it comes to public testimony on Native mascots is actually hearing from the students themselves. When you're talking about war chants or tomahawks, or even just the cartoon figures that we have on the sides of school buildings. As a matter of fact, just recently I heard that Saugus has a whole new school building with a large Indian head on the side of the building. You know, a lot of that just doesn't make sense to the students that are going to the schools, so the cheerleaders, the athletes, most especially the youth that are of color. They do not, they are not. It doesn't resonate with them. They don't understand like where all of these stereotypes come from. Thankfully, you know, at the beginning of this year, we had about 40 public schools with Native mascots. And throughout the year, I've actually lost count, but a number of them. And most notably, North Quincy High School actually redesigned their Yaku mascot. So, you know, there's definitely like a town by town, school by school push. But there is still the state legislation because we do, you know, our community does feel that this is a civil rights issue. When you go, you know, and talk about the Indigenous agenda broadly, we're talking about Native mascots in public schools. We're talking about the seal and motto being on display in courthouses, council chambers, the state house. We're talking about you know, the protection of Native American heritage, making sure that our sacred objects don't get sent to auction houses when public entities move to deacquisition them. And so when we look at it systemically, we are talking about you know, a body of legislation that can really help to improve the confidence between Indigenous peoples and the Commonwealth when it goes to, you know, our youth in schools, when it goes to, you know, when we leave school and we become civically engaged young adults, and then even beyond the grave, you know, we have to combat this issue of theft from Indigenous peoples. So while the bills themselves have their own histories separately, they do function as a system.
Yeah. Keeping at the Q&A, a lot of questions rolling in. We have Ken, who appears to be from Brighton. He says, "Hi, Jean-Luc, thank you." And he's asking about what tribes originally inhabited Boston, particularly the Brighton area, and when. Maybe you could sort of just address broadly that question in terms of, you know, this general area. I know it's obviously a big question, but
it's a very big question because you know, this year we were coming into this year we were going to observe the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower. For Indigenous peoples, a more apropos anniversary would be coming in next year. April 1621 was when the treaty with Massasoit was signed between Massasoit, representing his confederacy, and the Pilgrims. And so that begins the government-to-government relationships that Indigenous peoples have with what would eventually become the United States. And when we look at that confederacy, we're looking at a whole universe of tribes that have ancestral and cultural ties to this land. Of course, right now we have the Massachusetts, we have the Nipmuc, we have the Wampanoag within the state. Outside of the state, in Maine, because Massachusetts Bay Colony took up part of what we now know as Maine. So we're talking about the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq. But then also there are tribes, you know, like the Abenaki in Quebec, or the Delaware Nation in Anadarko, Oklahoma. Tribes that were pushed out through epidemics and wars, but still do continue to this day and still have, still maintain ties to the area.
Yeah. Keeping with the Q&A here, you know, I think for, you know, I think for a lot of, you know, sort of non-Indigenous people, you know, obviously, you know, we get to November, Thanksgiving. This is kind of like the time of year when, you know, if we're, you know, like, you know, the Native American sort of part of the American mythology becomes front and center. And I find that, you know, there's a tendency where it's sort of such an old story that it sort of freezes a moment in time. And Kathy's asking a question which I find really interesting. She's asking, what's important for us to know about Indigenous people living here in Massachusetts today, like in 2020, not thinking about 1620 at all, but 2020.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing that I'll go back to, the fact that Department of Public Health does not report COVID-19 cases when it comes to American Indians and Alaska Natives. Our population within the state is upwards of 50,000 people. We have serious issues with data equity. So when it comes to, people asking us what exactly is going on with the community, of course, we know anecdotally from the grassroots, what are the impacts. But, there is a need for our non-Indigenous allies to call the state and ask them, why isn't data being reported on the Indigenous communities here within Massachusetts? Earlier this year, one of our federally recognized tribes, the Mashpee Wampanoag, navigated almost having their reservation being disestablished, and so there was a really big push to stand with Mashpee at a time when all of our Indigenous nations are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Even though we don't have those numbers within the state, we can look at Navajo Nation. We can look at the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, who are faced with infection rates higher than that of New York City. So of course, our peoples are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. But I would also say that we are disproportionately impacted by police violence, and some of our communities are on the front lines of climate change. Back home in Louisiana. In Southeast Louisiana, there's the Ile de Jean Charles Band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw, a state-recognized tribe that is the world's first climate change refugee community, having lost 95% of their land since 1955. So, we are absolutely dealing with climate change. We're absolutely dealing with the pandemic. We're absolutely dealing with police violence. So these are the frontline issues that we're dealing with today.
Mm. Question from Emily, who is asking a language question. You said earlier your family, back in Louisiana, language is sort of part of the family business, it sounds like. Yeah. And so she asks, what are some examples of how the indigenous language or languages that you speak shape your worldview?
Oh, absolutely. It's a great question. When going back to the point about climate change, one of the things that, in my own personal work that I try to push forward is the preservation and development of traditional ecological knowledge. And that is something that is encoded in the ways that we communicate. So the ways that we navigate the world, all of the ways that we work with the plants, the relationships that we have with animals, that is within our language. And so when we actually do the language revitalization work, we're bringing back the ways in which we steward the lands that are our traditional homes.
Olivia, question from Olivia here, and I'm sort of broaden it out, which is to say, like, we know you addressed COVID a little bit and disproportionately affecting Native communities, but also, affecting businesses, et cetera. Olivia's asking how the lack of hosting powwows this spring affected, different communities in this area, if at all. And is there a way that, like, folks, are there websites, places people can go that maybe financially benefit tribes or give support, purchase products, whatever, due to a lack of being able to gather, or businesses, or whatever it is?
Yeah, and I really want to send out my gratitude to the team behind the Facebook group, Social Distance Powwow. I believe it's Dan Simmons from the Mashantucket Pequot, and his team that have taken the powwow road and ported it online digitally. So, earlier this year we had many people, dancing in regalia from home, and kind of, sharing their culture. But I mean, it is highly, it's critical for us to have that. It's not just a cultural demonstration. It is ways in which we bond with each other spiritually, and it is in a way the way in which we keep ourselves well. Especially in this pandemic, going back to the issues of language, the disconnect that we have with our elders because they are a vulnerable population, that disrupts language revitalization efforts, that disrupts contact with elders that grew up speaking the language, or can mentor the next generation. But we have tried our best to port a lot of these efforts, whether they're powwows, whether they are language revitalization efforts, doing as much as we can to port them online. But it's to mixed results. I mean, I can talk about the digital divide within our communities. But yeah, it's very, it's felt. It has a deep impact to not have powwows.
Yeah. These language revitalization efforts, can you talk a little bit more about what they are, how they work, and why they're important?
Yeah. So, for instance, like back in my home tribe, we have the Tunica language and culture revitalization project, which is a collaboration between my own tribe, the Tunica Biloxi tribe, and Tulane University in New Orleans. Before that, I would say that, that actually got formalized in 2011. Before that, it was an effort that my immediate family had taken on for as long as I had been alive. And a lot of it boils down to gathering a lot of the language documentation that survives in archives, listening to elders, collecting as much as we can of our story and song tradition, and just maintaining that. Until the time when we actually were able to formalize the program through that collaboration with Tulane University, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and we'll actually, by extension, the bands of Wampanoag that are here in Massachusetts benefit from the Wampanoag language reclamation project, which is in part started through MIT. Jessie Littledoe Baird, Vice Chairwoman Baird, heads the program. And yeah, I mean, we have gone through centuries, decades, where our languages have been disrupted. And, with that disruption, again, we're talking about the disruption of traditional ecological knowledge. So language loss contributes to climate change. Climate change contributes to language loss. It's a vicious cycle. And we have to do whatever we can to bring forward our knowledge into this time.
Mm. A number of questions here are asking about, terminology. We're speaking about language, Native American, American Indian, Indigenous. Is there a right? Is there a wrong in terms of terminology? How should folks think about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, you think about Indigenous. You're thinking about Indigenous peoples versus nation states. So we're having that international type of language, which is not just Native Americans here in the United States, but we're talking about the Maori in New Zealand. We're talking about the Sami in Europe. So, for North American Indian Center of Boston, we call ourselves the North American Indian Center of Boston because we provide services for American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians here in the United States, but then also we have First Nations peoples that come to the Boston area using Jay's Treaty, using their tribal IDs to cross the Canadian border and to come here for work. And so we absolutely use, or we try to be inclusive as possible within our languages. But of course, like when we're speaking about our own communities, our own families, we definitely use, I use Tunica Biloxi.
Final question for you, Jean-Luc. I got to let you go, sadly, but Olivia asks, how can I, as just one person, help advocate for American Indians? What can general person do to learn, to advocate, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to NAICOB.org, UAIN.org. We have donation links. Behind me, my background is actually the National Day of Mourning, which is now in its 51st year of observance. Of course, we're going to modify the program in response to the pandemic, but that's something that's coming up next week. But I urge everybody to go to maindigenousagenda.org to learn about the bills that are currently in the Massachusetts legislature. Of course, we're very happy that the Senate has voted unanimously to pass the Seal and Motto bill, and we're very hopeful for the Mascots and for Native heritage. But we need more people to contact their legislators here within the Commonwealth. So please do all you can, and yeah, looking forward to building with everybody that's here on the show.
The show, the chat, the computer,
yeah.
whatever you want to call it, whatever.
I know.
Jean-Luc Pierite, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and all of us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that was Jean-Luc. Now I'm excited to bring our next guest to my screen and yours, Katsitsionni Fox, who is a filmmaker, artist, educator. Gjini, thank you for being with me.
Thanks, Edgar. Thanks for having me.
So you have a new film out right now. So maybe we could start talking about that a little bit out of the gate. I was watching a trailer for your most recent film, and I'm going to get this kind of wrong, but there's this moment in the trailer where there's a conversation happening and somebody says something along the lines of, history not being necessarily what happened, but being who gets to tell the story. And it sort of struck me, and I sort of thought to myself, I wonder if this is like a driving principle for like why you made this film or why you make films in general. And I suspect maybe it is.
It totally is. I want to start by introducing myself. So Sego Katsitsionni Yungets Wakskalewage Akwesasne Nuet Gidalo. So my name is Katsitsionni, which in our language means that I make flowers. I'm from Akwesasne and Mohawk territories, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which our original homeland is here in New York State. So I'm calling from our homeland. And I'm Bear Clan, and I'm the director of Without a Whisper. And you're totally right, Edgar. So that's one of the reasons why I make films. I'm an educator in our community. I've been teaching for over 20 years. I'm also an artist. And I see firsthand, how we are written out of history in most times. So in a lot of things, contributions of our people are not recognized, and it's important that they are. So that's one of the reasons why I do film.
Does that, you say you've been an educator for 20 years. Mm-hmm. Is it frustrating? Is it how do you not lose your mind with anger with the idea that, again, as you say, contributions from your people, from, people all over, this land are not included in our history. How do you not lose your mind with just
Well, I'm fortunate. I'm teaching in a public school. The majority of our students in our school are Native American, and the classes that I teach, I have the opportunity to teach them that. So I teach Native studies. So we, do an in-depth teaching, especially on the Haudenosaunee people, where which we are part of. And I also teach film. So I'm teaching young people how to make films and, have their voices heard. And I also teach traditional art. So I have the opportunity, and I have my foot in the door to be able to do that. So that's, I try to look at it from that perspective and try to incorporate and give them as much as I can while I'm in the school.
Yeah. Let's break down some of that you're talking about just in that answer there. So one, you teach history. So what are some of the things that you introduce into your curriculum that you think are like majorly important, that you're like, okay, like if you take nothing else away from this class, you need to know this?
The class that I teach is like a Haudenosaunee 101. It's very specific to our people. So I teach about our creation story, which has a lot of our teachings in it. And our creation story started, of course, with Sky Woman. So it was a woman that was here first. And that kind of shapes our worldview and how we look at the world as being matrilineal, matrifocal. I talk about the clans and the introduction of clans and why that's important to us, especially in areas like when somebody passes away. You know, one clan's family is very sad, so the other clans, you know, help to carry them through that hard time. I talk about our ceremonies, and we're very fortunate that for our people, we still have our ceremonies, because there are a lot of Native nations that was lost, and our language is also very key. So those are some of the key things I teach, and also contributions. So there's so many contributions of Native people to the land. One of the most important ones is democracy. So for us, the Haudenosaunee people, people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, looked towards our people and how we governed ourselves, and took that and used it for the United States. Except they left out something very important, which is the women, because they couldn't even fathom having women, you know, in office. So that's a huge contribution, and that not only went to the United States, but all over the world. So democracy was not something that was known too much in other parts of the world. And also, you know, this film, women's rights.
Yeah, I was going to say your most recent film, Without a Whisper, you know, you said the importance of women, and also the kind of, you know, sort of lesser known or lesser than should be known contributions of, you know, Indigenous people. Those are both addressed in your most recent film. Talk a little bit about what it's about.
So my film, Without a Whisper, is about how our women, the Haudenosaunee, influenced the movement. The women's rights movement took place, like it started in Seneca Falls. And as I said earlier, I'm calling you from Haudenosaunee territory, which is pretty much all of New York State. So those early suffragettes were surrounded by our people. And we are very different than them, especially when it came to women. The European American women that were here just even 100 years ago had no rights. They had no rights in politics, no rights in their economy. When they got married, they're property of their husband. So it was like night and day, European women compared to, you know, Native women or Haudenosaunee women.
I just want to remind folks that if you have questions for Katsitsionni, please pop them in the Q&A. I've got one right now from Bob, who's asking about Native American filmmakers in the US. Bob asks, you know, are there a lot of them? You know, would you ever collaborate with them? Do you collaborate with each other on different series, etc.? And he also says, or with Ken Burns, you know, a public broadcasting audience there for sure.
Yes, there are other Indigenous filmmakers, and there's not so many of them. So, you know, you get to know each other because it's kind of a small pool. I do work with other filmmakers and like bouncing ideas off each other. I mean, I had a creative producer, Tracy Rector, who's from Washington, D.C. She's made over 400 films, or not Washington, D.C., Washington State, and she's made over 400 films. I actually just produced a series that is going to be coming out soon for Rematriation magazine, which is a Native women's magazine. And we did 10 segments on different Native women from all over. So that's, you know, something new that I'm doing.
That's cool. Just because you know, being an educator and a filmmaker and an artist, you've got all this time on your hands. So why not also, you know, work on this thing for a magazine? I mean,
yeah, why not, you know?
Yeah.
Well, it's so important. There's so few stories out there about Indigenous women that are stories of empowerment. You know, most of the time when you see Indigenous women, they're sexualized or they're brutalized. So that isn't what I see in our community. I see a lot of strong women that are doing very empowering things. And, you know, it's important for me as a filmmaker to show that.
Yeah, that's great. Pamela's asking about similarities between Wampanoag and Mohawk languages. Are there, and I'll broaden that to say sort of languages and cultures. You know, you talk about your people kind of in what we think of as upstate New York today. We're kind of, you know, as the crow flies, not that far from there here in Eastern Massachusetts. So how were those cultures connected? Similar language, yes or no, you know, in the years prior to Europeans coming over here?
Our languages aren't the same, and I wanted to, you know, kind of touch on that because there's over 500 different nations that live on Turtle Island, or North America, as you call it. And we all have different languages, we have different ceremonies, we practice different cultures. And as far as our relationship with the Wampanoag, I want to say Sago and greetings to them because I know you're calling from there on your end. We did have relations with them because that's where we got our wampum from. So our people used wampum as a form of recording our treaties and recording important things that happened in our history. And that's where we got our wampum from.
You know, you've talked about how your people have retained their ceremonies, other nations had not. You know, you talk about how, you know, all these different nations, these different peoples had different ceremonies. Walk me through what a ceremony is, what it might look like, why might a ceremony be held, and why is that important to your people's culture?
Well, for us, we still maintain our traditional ceremonies, and what our ceremonies are for are to give thanks to everything that is going on around us. So it's a lot different. Like when I teach a unit on this in class, and we talk about, you know, the holidays that we have in school versus ceremonies that we have in the community. And one of the big differences, the holidays that we have in school are mostly celebrating things that happened in the past or people from the past. And for us, our ceremonies are celebrating things that are happening like right now. So when the wild strawberries come out, we have a ceremony to give thanks for them. When we hear the thunder beings coming back from the west, we have a ceremony to thank them. We have a ceremony for our corn, our beans, our harvest. So there, you know, ours revolves around, you know, what sustains us. And we're very fortunate that we still have that and have the speakers and the knowledge holders to still conduct those ceremonies.
And what happens at a ceremony? Like, for example, I mean, you know, pick one as an example and you say you have speakers, et cetera. So like what happens?
Well, usually the ceremony will start with our Ahanda Galiwa Dekwa, which is our Thanksgiving address. And it's an acknowledgement to all of the natural world. So when we give that acknowledgement, we thank the people, the earth, the waters, the fish, the bugs, the grasses, the medicines, the animals, the trees, the birds. So it starts on the earth and goes up into the sky to the thunder beings, the winds, the sun, the moon, the stars. And we open with that. And then we have like certain dances that go with that and speeches that go with that. And it's all done in our language, like just to give that, you know, that good medicine and that thankfulness that we still have those things in our life.
How sort of, you know, how large is your community there in upstate New York, both sort of land-wise and also people-wise?
In our community, we have maybe about 12,000 people that live here in Akwesasne territories, and a really unique community. We have an imposed border that runs through our community. So half of our, you know, some of our people live in Ontario and Quebec, and some live in New York State. But it's, you know, Akwesasne was here before the border.
Yeah. What are the big issues facing, you know, your communities right now? You know, Jean-Luc addressed some of the stuff that, you know, his organization is working on here, you know, in an urban environment in Boston and in greater Massachusetts. What about for you?
In our community, some of the most important things that we are working towards is making sure that we're passing on the language and the culture. And we're fortunate in our community that we have a lot of older speakers, but we're really working on getting our youth to be able to speak. And we have a really great school in the community, the Akwesasne Freedom School, that is a school that's taught entirely in the language, and entirely the curriculum is based entirely around our culture and traditions, and it goes up to grade 8. So we're very fortunate to have that, and we actually get speakers that come out of that school. So that's one of the most important things. The other thing that I wanted to mention that hasn't been mentioned tonight is bringing awareness to missing and murdered women. So this is a phenomenon that's happening in both Canada and the United States, where Indigenous women go missing, and it's not, you know, put in the press. It's like very hush hush when it happens to Indigenous women, and it's something that needs to be addressed. I mean, in my film, I talk about how for Haudenosaunee women, abuse of women was pretty much unknown to our people. And today it's rampant. Like it's for Indigenous people, that's something that's happening to our women, and we need to talk about those issues.
So what can those of us, you know, who hear you talking about this and are sort of like, okay, whoa, this is an issue. What can or should we do, or how do we help? How do we talk about it? Like what can be done?
I think like to learn about it. I mean, there's a lot of different organizations and artists and people that are bringing awareness. I think of like Christine Belcourt did this installation of moccasins that was on this topic of missing and murdered women, where she made all these moccasin vamps that represented all of these women that have passed away, and a lot of them they're not found, or their murders are unsolved. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing it up. Turning to the Q&A, you know, there's a few questions in the Q&A, you know, addressing the issue of trying to be appreciative or integrate or acknowledge without sort of appropriating. Yeah. You know, and, you know, one example here from Phoebe, who says that her church is they're considering integrating a native land acknowledgement in their services, but you know, they don't want to appropriate a tradition, but like, you know, how do we do that right? Do you have advice for those of us who want to either show support or what have you without sort of appropriating?
I think like earlier, Jean-Luc did a land acknowledgement when he was on, and I also did it too. I think a land acknowledgement, you're just acknowledging the land that you're on. And I think a lot of people don't think about that. Like anywhere that you're standing on Turtle Island was somebody's traditional homeland. And just even to acknowledge that is a start in the right direction.
Why Turtle Island? Where did we get the name Turtle Island?
Turtle Island, for us, for the Haudenosaunee people, it's from our creation story. So in our creation story, when Sky Woman came here from the sky, it was all water here. And a turtle came up from the water, and she landed on the turtle's back, and she started to sing songs, and the turtle expanded into the earth. So that's where the terminology Turtle Island comes from. And if you look at the shape of North America, like if you look at it from a distance, it looks like a turtle.
That's pretty good. I like that, Turtle Island. How would you say it in your language?
Well, the earth, we say Yakinista, which means Mother Earth. And that's where we get all of our sustenance from.
Are there places that people can go to learn these languages, to learn more about these languages, to learn to speak them even?
There's apps out there. So I know that like for us, there's Mohawk apps that you can find. There's things online that you can find. Of course, the best place is to actually go to the speakers, and most of them are elderly.
Tell me about some of your other films, not your most recent one, but what other films have you made, and what do they center on?
So my last film that came out in 2016 was called Under the Husk, and you can find that if you look online. So underthehuskfilm.com. And it was a 26-minute documentary, character-based. It followed my daughter and her best friend through their rites of passage ceremony. So this is something that we were able to bring back to our community that had been missing for generations. So we were able to bring the ceremony back to transition our young people from adolescence to adulthood, and the, you know, the responsibilities that go with that.
What is that ceremony like?
Well, the way that it's for men, or young women and young men. So young women, when they go through their moon time, when they start to menstruate, and for the boys, when their voices change, that's when it's time for them to do this. And it's something that they want to do. So it's not something every youth in the community does. It's up to the youth if they want to go through it. So for the girls, they choose aunties that'll be their mentors, and it can't be their mom, because at that time when they're adolescents, you're kind of butting heads with your parents because you want to be independent. So you pick aunties, and it doesn't even have to be like blood relatives. It could be people that they really look up to. And it's a 4-year process, or a 4-year ceremony that they go
wow.
through. And they learn, like they'll meet like weekly, and they'll get different teachings, like on how to cook, on how to build a fire, on the creation story, like all of our, cultural teachings. And then in the spring, they do a fast. So they go by themselves, and they'll build, like they have a little lodge, and they'll stay out there by themselves with no food and water. And every year they stay out there longer. So the first year it's 1 day, and then next year 2 days, 3 days, and then the last it's 4 days for the final when they finish. And when they come out, then they're with the women or they're with the men.
Wow. How long has that been reintroduced, that ceremony?
This is going to be the 17th year, and it's not only going on in our community, it's expanded to other Haudenosaunee communities. Like it's also in Tyendinaga, Six Nations, Oneida. So a lot of the other communities have come to learn from us, and then have started it in their own communities.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How is it popular? Is it like something that like only a couple kids do, or is it like something that's kind of cool to do?
I don't know if I would term it as that. It's because it's such a humbling thing to do that. That's what I've seen, and that's why I made a film about it, because I noticed a big difference in the youth that went through that. Because if you put somebody out in the woods like that, and they're isolated, and just think about how you'd feel if it was you.
Yeah.
You have no food, you have no water, you have no phone, and you're just sitting there with all of your relatives in nature. And so it really humbles you to do that. And it's a very trying experience to do that. But I find that the youth that come through that find themselves quicker. So they're out there to find what are their gifts, like why are they here? Like why were they sent here? And that's kind of what we're all trying to do while we're here. So that's one thing that helps them in that direction.
Do you find, or have you found, or maybe even through your film, this is sort of part of it, but does it become as important for the woman who's chosen as the auntie, like the sort of mentor figure, does it end up being as like sort of meaningful to them as it is to the teen who's going through it?
I absolutely think so. I mean, I had a hard time making that film because it was so touching for everybody that was involved with it, the moms, the dads, the aunties, but I just had to focus on the point of view of the youth, because that was my focus for the film. But a lot of the aunties that are mentoring have they've never done it themselves. So it's like they're being able to kind of experience that through the youth. And we've been doing it so long that now that some of those youth that have gone through it are now coming back as the mentors.
Oh, wow.
So my daughter and my son both have gone back to be aunties and uncles to other people, other youth that are coming through.
Oh, wow. So your son and your daughter both went through it, and yeah. Wow.
My son was in the very first group, and there was only 7 of them. And then now there could be up to 100 people that are fasting. So it's really grown.
That is wild. That is really interesting.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions in the Q&A. Obviously we're coming up on Thanksgiving right now, and Jean-Luc talked a little bit about the National Day of Mourning. But Teresa's asking, like, in the eyes of Native Americans, is there a proper way for people of European descent to celebrate Thanksgiving? Is it a tricky time of year for folks, from the various Native nations here? What are your thoughts as Thanksgiving rolls around?
I think that to stop perpetuating the old, Pilgrims and Indians myths that are out there. For me, what I would say, as a Haudenosaunee woman, is to be grateful for everything that we have in nature. Like I said earlier, that's one of our main teachings is the Thanksgiving address. So there's books on that. Jake Swamp has written a book on the Thanksgiving address. There's other books on that. There's even videos on it that you can find online. I just showed one in class today. So those are some ways that you can be honoring the natural world on Thanksgiving.
I'm speaking with Gjini Fox. Our time is almost up. Before I let you go, I love talking with, with other media makers, filmmakers, writers, specifically not just about their work, but about work that they like. So I'm going to ask you for, you as a filmmaker and artist for a recommendation for us, other than your own work, which we should all go check out. But what's a film or a book that you would highly recommend to those of us here, either related to what we've been talking about or one that you just love that you feel like doesn't get enough attention?
There's one of my favorite films is from Taika Waititi. It's called Boy, and I think it's on Amazon. So that's just one of my personal favorites. I really love reading Joy Harjo. So she's a poet laureate right now. She also has a new memoir that's out. That's great. So those are a few of my personal recommendations of books I like to read.
Love it. I love that stuff. Gjini, you should know before we get out of here, her latest film, Without a Whisper, is currently airing on GBH. You can check that out, right? And we should all check it out, right?
History is not what happened, it's who tells the story. These women had to see something that told them that it was possible.
My grandma would say, we're not feminists, we're the law.
Gjini, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It was great. And thank you for having me on your screen live from my living room here in Somerville. That's it for Boston Talks. We will be back with another one. So keep your eyes on your email and at wgbh.org for details about our next Boston Talks. That's about it. I'm Edgar B. Herwick III from GBH's Curiosity Desk. Stay curious out there, and thank you for being with us tonight.